On today's episode, Josh and I talk to Jesse Phillips about all things crypto mining. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to join the dark side of the Hodl Moon mining pool and claim your block rewards. You are now orbiting the dark side of the Hodl Moon. Hodl Moon! All right, and we're back with another episode of Dark Side of the Hodl Moon. I'm Blockade. I'm here with Josh again today. Josh, how you doing?
I'm all right, thanks. Let's get into this new episode. I'm excited to talk to this guest and find out a lot about the new topic, which today is going to be crypto mining.
Yeah. So I met this gentleman in the New England crypto space. I've seen him give a couple speeches. He knows his crypto mining. And with no further ado, let's announce him. From Harpia Mining, it's Jesse Phillips. Jesse, how you doing today?
Great. Thank you so much for having me here. It's a pleasure to be on.
Yeah, we're excited too. We're kind of interested in crypto mining. None of us really mine ourselves, except if you count Honey Miner running on the GPU, cranking out a couple pennies every month. But other than that, I don't think Josh or myself consider ourselves crypto miners. But let's start from the beginning, just to kind of rewind it a little bit. So when and how did you first get into crypto?
All right, this is an interesting story. So I think my origin story is very similar to a lot of people that are kind of interested in alternative lifestyles and crypto in general. A lot of people that I know got into crypto, or at least were exposed to, I would say, Bitcoin at first through the Silk Road. And so my first foray into it, I wasn't the one that purchased the Bitcoin. But to be perfectly honest with you guys, it was for things that I probably shouldn't talk about on air right now. And this was in high school for me, and so I had heard about it, and I remember speaking to my father in probably 2010, the first time I ever heard about it, and that was on a Steam game. So I used to play a lot of computer games. That particular game was Day of Defeat Source, so similar to Counter-Strike. And someone had offered me a bunch of Bitcoin for my Steam account. And so I looked into it a little bit, didn't realize, kind of like what it could be. I think the number was like 50 Bitcoin or something for my Steam account at that time. And I said no to the person, even though they were on my friends list. And then fast forward a couple of years, I'm talking to a couple of friends, and they're like, "Hey, have you heard about this thing called the Silk Road, where it's like Amazon for everything that you can't buy on Amazon?" And I'm like, "Let's check it out." So I downloaded Tor browser, figured out my way on there, and then had one of our friends, mutual friends, who had already kind of understood buying Bitcoin, basically buy the Bitcoin and get it. I will say this: it is legal now in Massachusetts. It was not then. So that was the first foray into it. That's how I kind of got into it. Fast forward a little bit, I kind of, don't really look at it for a couple of years. And at the end of college, one of my friends who actually works still in blockchain Bitcoin stuff basically comes up to me and says, based on your thesis and kind of what I'm interested in, I think you're really gonna find this interesting. I had done reports on the Silk Road because I was always fascinated with it, for public speaking my freshman year and all. But he introduced me, and that was when I bought my first ETH and Bitcoin. And at that time, I think I bought my first Ethereum for around $55 and Bitcoin for under 1,000, I remember. And basically just started trading from there and got really, really into it that summer. So that was 2017. So a little bit of 2010, 2013, 2017. It's been gradual.
Yeah, that's cool. I kind of came about it through reading libertarian blogs, and that way it sounds like you came at it a little bit from the gaming or the tech side. And also through Silk Road, I guess.
Yeah, I think I remember distinctly also always being kind of interested in alternative forms of monetization and cryptocurrency, like that kind of thing. I didn't really understand what it was for the world. But I remember distinctly being in school in college when Mt. Gox got hacked. So when they shut down in 2014, and thinking to myself, maybe I should buy Bitcoin for $1 when it crashed. But I just didn't I was busy with my own stuff, and I just kind of passed that opportunity up. I do remember at the very end of college though, just through looking through, I'm pretty active on Reddit. Looking through that, I saw I was asking on Bitcoin mining forum or on the Reddit subreddit what ASIC I should use to mine in my dorm room the end of senior year. So I've always been interested in a little, but yeah.
Nice. So you kind of heard about it. You didn't want to give up your gaming account for 50 Bitcoins. And then a few
Yep.
years later, you're back into it. And then you kind of went full steam ahead with it, it sounds like. And was it for the money? Was it for the politics? Was it for the tech? Was it for a combination of all three? Like, what kept you into it?
Yeah. It's something that I also like kind of wonder too. I think it was the idea that you could participate in something much larger than yourself. And also fundamentally, I was fascinated. I've worked a little bit in VC as well. I spent a long time in Silicon Valley in terms of basically my past. Um, I attended Draper University the first year through that, and so got very interested in entrepreneurship and that whole realm. And I was really interested in fundraising techniques. And actually, when I graduated school, I was working for a place called the IEC, and it stands for International Entrepreneurship Center. And they had a company come through there that was basically trialing out an ICO raise. And so I was already interested in what Bitcoin and this whole blockchain thing was. Had already kind of bought into Ethereum and was making money trading it. And so I got brought on as kind of the crypto expert for them. In hindsight, it was kind of crazy that they trusted me with that. I wrote the white paper, or I mean, co-wrote it, but really did most of the grunt work on that one. And so yeah, I was really, I really think that it was the idea of an alternative fundraising technique. So the ICO thing really fascinated me. I was like, here's a way that entrepreneurs that don't have kind of that can be from anywhere, not just Silicon Valley, can get started and raise for really cool projects that are also kind of decentralized. And I thought that was really interesting and hopped right into that. So
Cool. So you kind of came into it from the business, tech, finance, fundraising, VC kind of route, I guess.
yeah, I was always interested in Kickstarter and crowdfunding, but thought it had some limitations. And now I was like, oh, ICO, this is awesome. You know, people are raising absurd amounts of money. This is the type of money where you can really, build a team out, get started, actually, do something, and you're not giving up equity, which is traditionally how a lot of the, seed and Series A rounds go, where you give up massive amounts of equity. So I was like, this is a home run if you can pull it off. And yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. And can you tell me what company it was, or
Yeah. So the company is called 18 Moons. It's still in existence as far as I know. It was a dual-sided kids platform. So it's a double-sided marketplace. So it was for content creation. And actually, I think the idea for it was really well ahead of its time. What it was essentially doing is democratizing the content creation side of that YouTube had kind of failed to do. Meaning that YouTube in general is a great place to publish content, but the way the algorithms work and the way that people get big on there is not very conducive to new content creators, and especially for niche things like kid stuff. And at the same time, you had problems where you can get to the weird side of the internet very, very quickly on YouTube.
Mhm.
And so a lot of the filters for kids, like YouTube Kids, don't really work that well. So this was a way to basically call for content or crowdsource content, and people would be paid out in these things called Planet Kids coins, or PKK, and that was for the content creators. And on the other side, they would pay a small bit of that basically to submit. So because if you have like a little barrier to entry, it wouldn't you wouldn't get all the kind of like useless crap, so to speak. So we designed that. We actually, this is crazy. We got picked up on Bloomberg Radio. We made the front page of the Boston Sunday Globe, on the business section, and and what was it? I think it was a $10 million raise. So we are trying to set something relatively low compared to a lot of the stuff like Filecoin that was raising, in the 200 million range, I believe. This was at its core a utility token. And it was a really interesting project, very interesting to design, like token economics, and and so this is, and we had, Samsung Kids was out of South Korea, I believe, was kind of basically pairing up. So we had all the makings of something where I think we really could have actually been successful. And about a week before our raise, I believe it was March 2018, the William Francis Galvin, basically, or I guess one of the junior guys from the SEC, basically bring the ban hammer down, and just basically to everyone that was doing ICOs in Massachusetts at the time, they sent basically kind of like a cease and desist type thing. And we weren't able to they said, you're not able to talk to your community or like update your website for 3 months. And finally they said,
Wow.
hey, it actually does not qualify as a securities, and it actually is a utility token. And we were like, yep, knew it. But by that time it was way too late. We had lost the community, and the ICO was dissolved. So
Yeah, that's a bummer. I mean, me and Joshua talked a lot about that on the channel about doing crypto in the U.S. And was it a federal issue or was it a state issue? Because a lot of people are going to Wyoming and a few other states that are more crypto friendly. Was it the state that was cracking down on you?
yeah, it was Massachusetts.
Okay.
And yeah, I've actually had talks with people. Wyoming is super progressive in that sense. So I've had talks with people from Wyoming about the ICO space and just kind of alternative fundraising and all that. So
Yeah. Well, you've got to be asking yourself at least two what if questions. What if I bought Bitcoin at $1? And what if we were allowed to go through with that company? That could have been pretty lucrative and pretty game changing, huh?
yeah, I think there's a lot of stuff left over from 2017 that has, in due course died off. And I think that's kind of for the better. There's a lot of, I mean, I would say crap projects, or as some people call them, shit coins, that came around during that. My favorite actually is, I believe it was alpaca fur that was tokenized. And that was like a real ICO. So it was, kind of just one of those Wild West moments. I've heard so many stories of people. I know people personally that mined a ton of Ethereum back in the day, and then got lost on an exchange when the exchange was taken over, or people that had a bunch of stuff in the wallet. So I try not to go over like the what ifs, because knowing myself and kind of just in general, I think most people that like hodl throughout, like did so unwillingly or unwittingly, meaning like they just forgot the key, and then 10 years later they're like, oh my god, I have that. But
Yeah.
to really hold on, like I guarantee you, I would have been in college or something and been like, yeah, I could totally buy a new computer, or treat my friends to dinner or something, and sold the Bitcoin for like $50. So
Yeah.
I try not to think about like what if like that, but it's always, kind of in the back of your head, like what if we
Yeah.
actually completed this raise, where would
Yeah.
my life be now? Yeah.
The last interview, Coach K, his friend in college, he made a ton mining Bitcoin at the time, and he bought like a BMW and a bunch of weed. He lived in Canada. It was maybe $50,000 at the time, but if he would have held it, if he would have hodled it, he'd be a multimillionaire. But yeah, it's always one of those what if questions. Well, that's maybe a good transition to actually get into what we're talking about today, crypto mining. So
Yeah.
you we found out how you got into crypto, and this, I guess, 18 moons, it sounded pretty interesting, but the U.S. ban hammer came cracking down. So how did you go from that to getting into crypto mining?
So I guess so. Fundamentally, I wanted to work in crypto, and I had kind of in the beginning of my career, I guess. Keep in mind, this is pretty close to coming out of school. I had kind of received probably the biggest kick in the teeth, because
Okay,
we really,
what year did you graduate? Give us some
so
context.
2017.
Okay.
2017. Yeah, so it's relatively recently in the grand scheme of things. I So I mean, the ICO basically fails for the reasons I told you about. That's a huge kick in the teeth, because I'm working on to be perfectly candid with you, I'm working on the prospect of like a success based thing. So I've always been entrepreneurial, and so I just kind of was like, hey, I think this will work if I put some time into this. This could be something, and I really think it could have. had the regulatory environment not changed in that way. But so I'm sitting there and I'm like, there's got to be a more secure and there's nothing ever risk free, but I will use the term now, risk free way to invest in crypto. And so actually, interesting enough, a lot of the carryover from that company, 18 Moons, came into our current company. And so my boss's son basically walks in to the IEC at that time the next day or maybe 2 days after, and has the rough beginnings of what later becomes kind of the Harpia model, and that's kind of what we base all of our projections off of. At that time, it was super rough, and it had a name which I won't bring out on air because it's rather embarrassing. But it's kind of one of those things where you can like totally think about like everyone's in the ICO mindset, and then they come up with some crazy name for it. And I said basically, all right, you know what? I'm going to do 40 hours a month. So essentially 1 day a week, I'm going to work on this project because I think it's interesting. At the time, this is actually kind of a funny story and keeps on coming back. At the time, I was dating my college girlfriend, now ex-girlfriend, who lived in Buffalo. So I was very familiar with Buffalo there, and was looking for a way to actually move to be with her. She would graduate basically the next year after that. So I was like, I have a year to basically do something where I can make enough money to move. And I looked at it and I'm putting all these things together, and I'm like, crypto mining might actually be a passive income source so that I can actually, kind of do another job there, and I'm not tied to just kind of slinging drinks or something in Buffalo. And I was actually at her house one day, and her brother had, we talk about like honey miner as if it's not like really so much crypto mining, but her brother had a gaming computer upstairs with a 980 Ti. It's an NVIDIA card. And I told him, I said, there's a program called NiceHash where you can download it, and like 15 minutes later, you'll be mining crypto. And so he downloads it, turns it on. At that time, it was making like, oh my God, I think it was like 450 a day, something crazy like that. It was crazy. It was the first time I saw that with him. It was crazy. And I was like, just so I'm clear, like, what are you paying for electricity? Because this matters. And he's like, I think it's like 5 cents. And my jaw like pretty much hit the floor there, because I'm sitting there like, oh my God, I figured it out. Like, I can just move here, run a couple of miners in a warehouse somewhere in the back of someone's warehouse, and literally have enough to afford rent there. It's just not that crazy. I mean, you can be on the main street like Allen Street and $1,000 a month or something. It's not like Boston. So I'm sitting there like my brain's just going, and I'm like, this is gonna be my future. Keep in mind, we also have this model that we've been working on, and so the original idea and our first trip as a company, we went to Buffalo to basically and met with a bunch of realtors who my ex's dad actually helped us out with that, to go find basically the back of some warehouse with enough power to go mine some crypto. We had an investor lined up at the time, and that was really kind of just the very beginnings of Harpia. We had no idea what this would turn into. So that's really the beginning, I guess. Summarizing, it's just like wanting to participate, but wanting something a little bit less risky than like betting it all on a token going out, trying to raise money. Wanted something that you could predictably monetize, and kind of like things fell into place where we were like Buffalo and Western New York in general is like a really great hotspot for it, and still is actually. And so kind of all that together allowed me to basically say, look, I'm going to take a chance. And I joined as basically COO. And for, I guess, the first probably 8-9 months at that time, it was just myself and my co-founder,
Okay.
Pedro. So that was the beginning of Harpia.
So did you build out a little mining operation in Buffalo? And was that like a Harpia operation? Was that like your own little side project, or?
Yeah, so I mean, I'll get into it as best as possible. We made, as most startups do, a lot of mistakes in the beginning, and for one, we raised money for a family and friends round, and we started off and basically said, look, we can't necessarily raise enough to do this, but we were going out and kind of hitting up the friends and family, like the networks that we've had already, and saying like, look, we need X amount to start it. And just to give you like an idea, it's like $500,000, we were basically saying, we'll cover like $2,000 a month rent. We'll go pull the power from somewhere. We kind of met the people that we needed to get the power there, and knew we were quite literally going to go to Buffalo, and half the time be marketing and working on the model, and half the time basically in in sweats and a t-shirt putting up computers on racks. So it was really like very hands-on. We ended up basically getting in bed with an investor who later had legal trouble in the United States, left us holding the bag. So that was the first of many oh God moments. And
Yeah.
those are the types of things that sink companies. So no, we actually never, we ran a test bench in Massachusetts with a bunch of graphics cards, because at that time they were still making money. But it never got off the ground in the first little bit in Buffalo.
Live and learn. He definitely left you hodling the bag, if I could say so
Oh
myself.
yes, absolutely.
All
I
right.
won't mention names, but he was an interesting guy.
So just to interject here, and maybe some of the audience might not know some of the terms, so maybe we could do like a little bit of a mining basics in terms of terminology. So
Sure.
Could you explain some of the terminology that is familiar to you, such as CPU, GPU, ASIC, ASIC distance, and things of that nature? Because I'm sure that lots of people are interested, but they don't know what, it's like a foreign language to them. So maybe you could explain,
Yeah, I'll go over kind of like a timeline in a way to help explain it. 2009, Bitcoin comes out, or at least the white paper is released by Satoshi Nakamoto. And at that time, it's this idea of one CPU for one vote, basically. And that stands for a central processing unit. It's when we look at modern ones, it's the Ryzen 3900X is like a flagship, or Intel, their i7, i9 line. Really, if you think about it, it's very good at doing a lot of the things in like basically everything that your computer does that's not specific to like a GPU or something. It ties everything together. Is the best way I understand it. GPUs are graphics processing units. That kind of came next in terms of what people were utilizing to mine, and essentially people realized that these things that can pump out millions of pixels a second are also very good at doing a bunch of very small calculations for mining purposes. And so you transition from basically CPUs, and there's a huge jump from then to GPUs. Then the first ASICs come out, which are application-specific integrated circuits, and those are essentially things where you can't run Microsoft Word on it. CPU, you plug it into your motherboard, you can run pretty much any program under the sun. ASICs are specific to their one particular task. So a good the kind of the ASIC that everyone knows is the Bitmain Antminer S9, which kind of sits as kind of the current everyone has it miner out there. And then FPGAs are kind of another kind of whole thing, field programmable gate arrays, which are, you can kind of think of it as an ASIC mixed with a GPU. ASICs are hardwired to do one particular thing. FPGAs basically act as an ASIC once they're programmed, but you're kind of like switching the internal wiring using software, so to speak. Nice. GPUs also can be utilized for many different algorithms, whereas ASICs are only one algorithm.
Yeah, I have a question too. I'm kind of a crypto mining newbie, and when I think of mining, I think of how it relates to mining diamonds or mining gold. So how deep do you have to go to mine crypto?
Oh man, it's a rabbit hole. You go down the rabbit hole and you're like, there's always something new to learn. So you got to go real deep, or you can go on the surface. You can buy something right now online from China, have it shipped to your door, and plug it in, and you can set it up. It's pretty simple, kind of like a router, right? But then when you start getting real deep, you're like, oh, how do I manage 1,000 of these things? What does the power look like? Who do I have to contact? So it's endless, man. In terms of its similarities to regular mining, in terms of similarities to regular mining, I would say a lot of the same scale is actually being deployed, meaning like the resources and power that people use to actually like mine for gold or diamonds, like that kind of size of and scale of money going into it is now going into crypto mining, which I think is more, kind of like the closest similarity, I guess.
Yeah. So, what are your thoughts on like the mining pools? So, obviously, you've got like F2 pool. I've heard of them because they actually backed one of the projects that I worked on. And what do you think about mining pools in general?
It's a mixed bag because obviously we have to work with them, but at the same time, you look at these things and you're saying you're pooling hash rate together. I look, there's I'm going to try to tread lightly here. That I think anytime I'm not completely against centralization of resources because I think that there's just most things in the world are actually better centralized. Even though I'm pretty interested in decentralization of almost everything, but I think functionally centralization is not a problem. I do think though that when mining pools have a ton of hash rate and have the power to kind of use that in a not so good way, that's when you run into problems. And so without naming names, there are mining pools where they're approaching basically 51% attacks if they were to use or were to point the power in that sense. And that just means essentially you can go in and alter things on the blockchain. So it's to me, we need them. Also, it's a great way for people that are trying to participate in mining, but are more on the programming side to also making these pools is also very lucrative. But like there's problems like, for example, with nice hash, especially with GPUs more so than ASICs, where people would essentially rent out or buy a lot of mining power and then point that all at something like, for example, like Verge was hacked in that way, where they did a 51% attack where they essentially altered things on the blockchain. So I'm in a mixed bag. Fundamentally, though, there's some people that have very interesting ideas on how to democratize and decentralize a little bit more of the pool structure as well.
Yeah, well, I think
that's not me.
Yeah, I think right now, like, unless you're gigantic, you have to be in a mining pool. It's almost a necessity. But that kind of
Yes.
you mentioned cloud mining. So can you give me your thoughts on cloud mining? You're renting hash power versus actually purchasing the hardware.
Yeah. So I mean, with a pool, right? Look, they are necessary, 100%. Especially because solo mining is at this point is a $1 billion+ proposition, which basically means you're just, instead of donating all your hash rate to and being paid proportionally to the amount of computational work you do, which is kind of pool mining, you're basically you have enough computational power to go and basically try to solve the block, which means you get the entire block reward. At this point, it's 12.5 Bitcoins roughly every 10 minutes. Cloud mining presents, first off, to my knowledge, not legal in the United States yet. But cloud mining presents really difficult challenges because of transparency. And so, to be perfectly frank with you, my dream is to have something along the lines of cloud mining, but to have people actually own the infrastructure under it and be very transparent about what that infrastructure is. But for example, let's say I'm a mining manufacturer and I create a chip that, and this has been done, by the way. For example, I will name this, like Bitmain used to and probably still do mine with their chips before they send them to people. Well, so, let's say you have, say, the S9 that comes out and they're being used. So they're more efficient at that time, say 2016, than anything else. And they're being used by that manufacturer. Well, if you have a cloud mining contract with that manufacturer or with someone that's running those, they can basically say, hey, we're running an S7, which is, loads less powerful, actually be running a different ASIC, or in the terms of like today, basically a secret ASIC, and be not very transparent about what you're actually running. And since you only own the hash power coming out of it and not the infrastructure or the chip itself, it's not transparent enough for me to inspire confidence for me. I don't technically like I wouldn't say that that's something that really interests me, because I think that the real upside of mining is also owning a bit of infrastructure as well, and having kind of like a cash flowing asset that you have, not just owning a certain amount of hash power, basically because you are open to more asset price valuation fluctuations, and how that really hurts you, right? I think it's better actually just to buy the coin at that time. So that's kind of my thoughts on cloud mining. It's also a really, really small and niche industry right now, but kind of like ETFs, I think once they do it right, it's going to be very big.
Yeah, I would say like I kind of agree with you, but I would say devil's advocate. I would say like one argument is like, well, if you do the cloud mining and you just do a short-term contract, you're not holding the bag if you have a bunch of worthless ASICs or out-of-date ASICs, or you've got a bunch of hardware you can't make money with anymore. I guess that would be the only upside. It's kind of an insurance policy versus going all in YOLO style.
Yeah, part of our investment thesis is hardware swaps, in terms of like basically transitioning out older miners to places where they can be run, transitioning in new miners, etc. And so I am probably very biased in terms of understanding how that monetization works on the other side. And so to me, the idea of running something but not owning it is not that interesting. That being said, I 100% agree. For some people, they just want to buy a contract on hash power, and that works for them. So I think there's a huge market for it. I would like to see it implemented in a better way, and fundamentally, just knowing the numbers on our side, the contracts that I've seen are grossly overpriced. So that's just kind of my opinion. But to each their own. It is definitely part of the mining scene.
Yeah, well, it seems I just had another question. Maybe if you're interested in getting into mining, it seemed like you really went from, having your ex's brother's NVIDIA card, just mining with that, and you just went to like full on warehouse mining. But I think a lot of people who they start with like, I think these days in the last couple of years, they start with a 2 GPU graphics card, 2 NVIDIA cards, or like a 4 card rig, 6 card rig, 8 card rig. Yeah. Sometimes they do like 2 8 card rigs. They've got a whole wall of GPU miners. I know people on YouTube, just out of curiosity, I've been following them a little bit, Voscoin, Red Panda Mining. So what are your thoughts?
Both great.
Yeah, so what are your thoughts about mining at home? Do you think it can be profitable? Do you think it's just interesting, a fun thing to do? Would you recommend newbies try that? Maybe they could try and mine, and if it doesn't work, they can still sell their graphics cards. They're popular on the secondary market for people who play video games. Like, what are your thoughts on like home-based GPU mining?
Yeah, look, I am super in favor of it. I might be biased because, to be fair, I think a lot of people that work in an office space can also run them profitably, only because their computer there is probably not getting metered, so to speak. Honestly, personally, and I just find this fun, I actually still run GPUs. So our original test bench that we made in a server case, we still run that just for fun. I still run, oh my God. I like to build PCs for a hobby, so I probably still run 3 or 4 graphics cards at any given time. Most of them are RX 580s. I've had NVIDIA cards. I've played around with all of them. And I think for someone getting into it, especially if you're a gamer, I've always said that, as long as you kind of just do the math out, it is a way to subsidize your gaming hardware, which I find really interesting. And you do learn a lot. There's not really a big barrier to entry, especially with GPU cards. So I'm highly in favor of it. I know NiceHash is kind of like all but shut down, but that's a really open starting point for a lot of people. There's other things like HiveOS and stuff like that. So I'm super in favor of it. I think profitability wise, we're going through kind of the last generation of home miners where they're not going for they're like very speculative coins, meaning something where it's stable enough to just say like, I have a idea of how much I'm going to make over X amount of time. Because there's always I think going to be low cap coins that you can allot your GPU power to and say, I'm hoping that this thing also goes up 50% on, on a trading desk or on an exchange. And then I'm going to cash out basically in time to market. That's, I think, always going to be a thing in terms of proof of work. But in terms of like, I really think that even if you look at like something like a GTX 1080 Ti, which was kind of the king for a while, it's an NVIDIA card, versus like the newer RTX models, they're just priced for performance. I think that ship has sailed quite a bit.
Yeah, so just to translate that real quick, he's basically saying that you might even be mining at a loss, but if you think the coin's going to 10x or go up in value, it's still worth it to mine it because you're speculating that the coin's going to go up in value, even if you're spending $300 worth of electricity to get $200 worth of coin. If you think it's going to go up, it's still worth it to mine it versus to buy it. But yeah, that's pretty interesting. Yeah, there's all kinds of interesting things. I honestly thought about buying this USB ASIC stick miner just for fun. I don't think it's very profitable, but it'd just be kind of cool to have one, I think.
So I actually love that idea. There's a whole community of people that actually, I guess, I don't know the exact term, but I think it's called like lottery mining, which is essentially using something really like, they're called block eruptors, those little USBs. Actually, people used to like plug in like 100 of them. So on Alibaba, you can still find like 100 USB like power splitters that plug into the wall. It's funny, but you can mine with those, and just setting it up will be an awesome introduction into this world. And one of the things people do is basically say like, all right, it's like a 1 in a billion chance that I'm going to find, or that I'm going to basically solo mine an entire block by myself. It's not impossible. So, but like if you think about it, and Bitcoin at say 10,000, you're making what, 12.5 Bitcoin, like $125,000 if you're, and you're running this thing at like half a watt. Like, what I mean? It's just, for a lot of people, that's like, that's better than going out and buying scratch tickets. So I like that idea. I think it's a really cool, like, community. And I also get super nerdy with things like, someone took an old IBM mainframe computer and it does like 6 hashes a second. Like it'll take like 3,000 years to like make a cent.
Definitely.
Get a
USB ASIC stick miner, Bitcoin lottery every 10 minutes. Roll the dice, baby.
Yeah, exactly. I'm all in favor of it. I think it's really cool. But GPU mining, I think part of I don't want to ramble too much, but I think part of the reason that we've developed kind of the model that we do is because GPU mining is cool, but you can switch to any algorithm that's profitable. In fact, there's profit switching programs that you can do that. When you buy an ASIC, especially if it's not just like a Bitcoin ASIC, you have to kind of understand the token economics behind it. And also that's a choice for so-called life. That's a choice for the life of that piece of hardware. You only get to make that decision once when you purchase it. If Bitcoin tanks, you're still left holding the bag with that ASIC. It's not like you can just switch it over to, say Ethereum and go mine with it. And so part of the reason that we do what we do and our kind of investment thesis is we're going to try to understand all of the data points that go into that so you can make the best educated decision off the get-go, because you only get one chance to make it with ASICs. Yeah, so
definitely. Let's transition to a huge part of mining, and that is electricity prices. So
yes.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. How are you going to justify these prices? This is going to be interesting.
Yeah, because Josh is in Korea. I'm in the U.S. I think you're in the U.S. So the U.S. and Europe and a lot of parts of Asia have pretty high electricity prices, but other places it's highly subsidized. It's free. Me and Josh have talked about this on the channel. So, how do you compete with that? And even state to state. I think where I'm outside Providence, and Rhode Island has some of the highest electricity prices in the country versus, some electricity prices out in the Pacific Northwest. They're half the price or less. So,
yeah. Aside from basically, I'll say this. There are pockets in the United States, and this is for investor confidence. There's, I think, always going to be, like, especially Soviet bloc type, like old infrastructure. Keep in mind that these are, when you're mining on a huge level, these are millions and millions of watts, so megawatts, right? You can get up to, some of the largest mines we know about are 200 megawatts, which is an unfathomable amount of electricity. To give you like a rough idea, like uh, say the town that I work in, which is kind of an average sized town, runs 50 megawatts. Just to give that, that's a day, so megawatt hours, right? That's for the entire town. So like when you look at some of these projects, they're massive. So you obviously need the lowest power rates. There's always going to be really cheap places, for example, like China on hydropower, where there's very little. They're running it right there, so there's very little transmission costs. There, during the wet and dry seasons, there's differences, obviously, but you're gonna be oftentimes sub 3 cent electricity. But in terms of investor confidence, we focus mainly on North America, and so in North America, there are pockets where it's much less expensive. One of the main places is in Washington State. That's where Google and Amazon run most of their data centers as well. Niagara area, where we started originally, Buffalo because of Niagara Falls, and also zoning laws having to do with kind of like the way New York is structured, natural gas facilities in kind of the West, and there are places in the United States where you can achieve sub 3 cents if you're really looking hard. But these are generally places in scale. Just to give you an idea how much it matters in crypto mining, like we're talking about the halving, which I'm not sure. Would you like me to explain a little bit?
Yeah, no, I think most of our listeners know, but he's talking about the Bitcoin halving. So it's at 12.5 right now, I believe.
Yep.
So it'll go down to, I guess, 6.25, and
Yep,
it'll
exactly.
continue. It'll continue to halving. So it's at 12.5 right now. Before that, it was at 25. Before that, it was at 50. So it keeps halving and halving. So some people think it'll make the price go up, but if it doesn't, you're getting half the coins.
Exactly, and your OpEx, so what you pay for electricity and maintenance and all that stays the same. So that's a kind of like a autonomous self upgrading of the network, which is really fascinating. That you get an entire network that upgrades basically autonomously based on economic pressures. But just to give you an idea, like the most common miner run right now, the S9, by most of our calculations, is basically dead at anything under 4 cents. And probably not even really worth running at that price, based on just like rack size and how much more opportunity cost it would take to run a bunch of those. And that's due to the electrical efficiency of these chips, and the process. So electricity price does matter a ton. What we try to do is balance, essentially we run a simulation where we balance two different variables, which is hash per watt and hash per dollar. So for example, it's all on a continuum. So hash per dollar is something like an S9 or a Dragonmint T1. These are all miners that are super cheap on the used market. And so you could get, something that hashes pretty well for 200 something dollars, say an S9. It's, but that's going to be really electrically inefficient. So you really, really need a very, very low power rate to make that worthwhile, versus something, in the middle, say like a T17 by Bitmain is a newer chip. It's a middle of the road chip, and that's a balance between basically, that thing may cost $1,400, but that's a balance between basically the ultra low, which is the hash per dollar on one side, and hash per watt on the other. And then you get to the super efficient stuff like the M20S or S17 Pro, where it's the most electrically efficient, but these things cost $3,000 a machine. So depending on your site and depending on, we do the whole thing. So depending on essentially where you want to go and what your capex is looking like, we actually pick a miner based on the site. Most firms that are going to advise in the space actually pick pick a miner before they pick the site. But we look at it as a holistic picture. But electricity price matters a ton. Right now, one of the more interesting projects we're working on is called Project Verde. And it is basically monetizing, and this is really where my head's at now. I believe everything trends towards zero, especially with renewables. So it's monetizing basically electrical capacity that the grid either won't purchase or won't transmit, and so getting it as close to zero as possible. So, for example, you've got hydropower facilities in Brazil that are running sub 1 cent electricity. And so we look at this as a continuum where we have client projects that are running, or like, we'll be running 5 cent, then, 3 cent power. And then, when those machines are done, they'll move over to there. So kind of having that runway of basically trying to squeeze the most amount of profitability out of all of them is really where our head's at. But I mean, you can run almost any machine on the planet indefinitely if you're sub 2 cents for the most part.
Yeah, I mean, we joked about it, but yeah, if you get free electricity in your dorm room or you take over the utility closet at your office space, just go YOLO.
Exactly. No, and people do that. Like, I will say this: if you there have been studies where you trace back a lot of the GPU mining, and like most of it is university students, because it's great beer money, honestly.
Definitely.
So,
all right.
yeah.
I want to get into Harpia, but I want to ask you one more general question first. So we've been talking a lot about proof of work mining, and there's other algorithms too. There's proof of stake, there's delegated proof of stake, there's hybrid proof of work, proof of stake. So I kind of want your thoughts on the future of proof of work coins in the crypto space. Because, some people, Andreas Antonopoulos, he thinks that in the future, Bitcoin is going to be the only proof of work coin. It's not necessary to have more than one. Other people think it's the most efficient, or it's the most secure, and there's going to be a lot of them. Some people think most are going to go to proof of stake. Some people think most is going to go to hybrid models. So do you have any feeling or take on what kind of consensus algorithms are going to be popular in the future?
Sure. Yeah. To put it plainly, our business is based off proof of work. Not that we haven't looked at like master nodes or proof of stake, and that sort of thing, but fundamentally, when we like look at kind of what we've built over the last 2 years, it's pretty much exclusively on proof of work. And so I am biased when I say that I think proof of work is here to stay. I also think that it is fundamentally the reason that Bitcoin is valuable. I look at Bitcoin very simply, and this is up for discussion because everyone looks at it differently. But I look at it as basically the price of the computer, amortized over the time period that computer runs, basically, and then times the electricity that it takes to run it, and that gives you one price, and that's your production price. And anything you can get higher than that, say on the open market, that delta is basically where your money is. But for example, when you look at kind of 2018 and the crash, if you notice it stays like at 3,500. Well, that's kind of that's the most efficient miner price. Like that is where the most efficient miners on the planet in our calculations are basically still a little bit profitable. So let's say they're mining at 3,200 or something, and they're selling it at 3,500. So I always think the proof of work is going to be here. I think I agree to some extent with Andreas when he thinks that Bitcoin will be king. I think it largely has to do with the fact that Satoshi is nowhere to be found, because all these other proof of work coins, you still have either like a kind of a central power or a company behind it or a board behind it, right? So I think that
that feeds in pretty well to the next question, actually, which is going to be about forks. So what are your opinions on the Bitcoin forks that have gone down, especially Bitcoin Cash, BSV, and the other forks? Could you just give your thoughts on the forks?
I'm pretty heavily into Bitcoin. I don't believe, like, for example, I get into fights on Twitter all the time with Bitcoin SB people. I think it's ridiculous. I understand, but like I understand some of their points, but fundamentally, like where's your Genesis block? Like I can any Bitcoin I have, I can trace it all the way back to like the chancellor on the verge of bailout. Like literally, actually, funny fact, my co-founder has that literally written on him. He has the Genesis block as a tattoo, which is pretty sweet. Trying to get, like, if you get really super nerdy with this, but I think that like when Bitmain and what's it called, like Bitmain with the whole BCH thing, where they were backing a lot of that, almost like that got Jihan Wu, who's their CEO, like out, like almost sunk it. I just think that it's a lot of people trying to manipulate the name and kind of the value behind Bitcoin for their own purposes, and I don't see it really adding to it. I'm very opposed to basically calling things Bitcoin that are not Bitcoin, and I think that kind of yes, like anything else in the world, and this is obviously probably it's an opinion. Like anything else in the world, there's always going to be change on a network, especially one that's based on basically miners' wishes. But I think that basically sticking to as close to kind of like Satoshi's original vision as possible is actually kind of a fallacy, because things are supposed to move and develop and change. In my opinion, it's like basically reading the Bible as gospel versus interpreting it. So I don't think that white paper needs to be adhered to 100%. So I will say that about forks, like some of them, there is some interesting ideas, and but fundamentally, I don't own anything else besides Bitcoin and ETH at the moment, and that's fundamentally because I just believe in the thing that has the most miner backing, and that would be Bitcoin at this time. So BTC.
That answers my question really quite comprehensively. That's good. So you really are holding just Bitcoin. You're only mining Bitcoin and Ethereum, and then sometimes you're mining some of the speculative coins that you think might increase in price, even if you're actually losing money in electricity. Is that right? So is that the three strategies?
Yeah, I mine Ethereum mainly. I don't mine Bitcoin per se for myself. We have clients that we've advised that do a whole bunch of other stuff. Obviously, it's always on a continuum. If you have a client that's very that's like not so, or that's risk adverse, you're always going to point them towards Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining. But it does have the most competition out of any network. So per dollar, there are other networks and other ASICs developed where you can make quite a bit more money. But the problem with that is also it's a higher risk, right? If that network gets 51% attacked, or the developers decide to leave, or there's other things that shake it up, it's not going to be as resilient as like Bitcoin or Ethereum for that matter. And so look, there's a whole bunch of people that are very into speculative coins, and that's good for them. As a company, we generally stick to advising on Bitcoin. That's what we find most clients are looking for. I will say this though about proof of stake. Yeah. I will say this about proof of stake, because I did gloss over the subject. Proof of stake is really cool, but I think fundamentally it's more interesting for internal applications, meaning that you have like a corporation or something, or a supply chain, where you don't, because fundamentally you don't need to essentially use all that power to confirm transactions or confirm things, like data on the blockchain. And so for those internal purposes and enterprise level solutions, I think proof of stake is absolutely going to be a huge thing. Delegated proof of stake, like all of these different, even proof of storage in some cases. Like I'm a huge Burst fan coin, even though I don't run it, so to speak. But like those are things that yes, like will be built, but will be there. But for public blockchains, where you don't know all the parties involved, I think proof of work is definitely here to stay. And so I'm very big on that. And I look at it. Yeah, that's nice. How I look at it.
So nice. Are you thinking about stuff like Facebook's Libra coin? That will be obviously something like a proof of stake, because it doesn't make sense for it to be proof of work. Things like Hedera Hashgraph, that's along those lines. All right, that makes sense. Well, you've also set us up really nicely to transition to talk about your business now, because
sure.
I think Harpia Mining, what do you do for clients? So you've mentioned clients, you've alluded to a couple of things that you advise them on. What are the range of services that you do at Harpia?
Sure. So fundamentally, the reason for Harpia, what we primarily focused on for a long time, it like any startup and like any business, it changes over time, but was to make that first purchase essentially the solid one. When we were in that original model that I alluded to, we had GPUs as well as ASICs in there. Now we primarily just do ASIC modeling, although there are things like composable compute and AI applications where some people may be wanting to run GPUs alongside for mining on the side or on other purposes, which is a whole different ballgame. But so fundamentally, what we built and what kind of influences all of our decisions as a company is data sets and an ability to do consultancy and management for clients, and fundamentally to advise on basically the first build out or a new hardware swap. And that's by running a ton of different data sets on things like difficulty, on things like as I talked about, hash per watt versus hash per dollar, on that sort of thing where we're basically trying, and it's mainly difficulty, trying to predict, well, what would this thing look like, not just in the next 6 months, and not linearly, but over the next 5 years, so that we can kind of reach a lot more of the larger financial institutions, and then eventually kind of bring that down to like a consumer level. So fundamentally, what we do is consult and manage for Bitcoin projects. I like to say that we're a boutique mining solution, and we essentially now can take people from step A all the way through step Z. Essentially, if you have capital on one side, we can run the simulations, tell you what miner to put at what place in the country. We have a whole portfolio of all of those places, as well as kind of everyone on speed dial in terms of all the major manufacturers for all of these things, as well as the used market, and really take you through the steps and deploy. I mean, we've got industry leaders on our team. We've got someone who's done data centers for 25 years at a much greater level than just crypto mining, and so that's really where we're at right now in terms of what we provide our clients. But a day-to-day thing is a lot of proposals for clients that show this ASIC versus this one. What are you going to make in the next 3 to 5 years? Here's what difficulty is going to look like at the halvening versus post halvening, and benchmarking things like asset price valuations against kind of like where a client would be. So saying at 8K Bitcoin, what kind of difficulty can you expect? Or, I mean, for layman's terms, what kind of competition can you expect? And thus, how much can you expect to make versus at 15K, right? At 15K, you can have home miners that are a lot more profitable, right? Whereas at 8K, it's pretty much the institutions, and that changes kind of all of the economics behind it. So I guess I was pretty long-winded, but
typical customer avatar, so to speak. If you describe who would be your typical client?
Sure.
In the marketing world, we like to say, "Oh, there's a customer avatar. We know what age they are. We know what gender they are. We know what they're into." If you could describe your perfect customer, what would it look like?
Perfect customer. That's hard. Someone who's ready to move quickly and has the capital that is willing to put it in. We operate on two different levels. As I said, we're kind of consultancy and management for Bitcoin miners. So on one end, for example, we do things like pairing someone that has existing miners up with a hosting facility and kind of sitting in the middle there. And that's a really easy transaction for us. So that's one of those ones where it's super simple. It's kind of like 2 phone calls if the client is really serious. And so on one end, we're helping in a way, and we've moved away from this in a little bit, but helping hosters basically seal up clients that they may not otherwise get, by giving them the types of data sets that show kind of profitability and what your I guess what your costs will be over a long period of time. And on the other side, it's primarily focused towards financial institutions and high net worth individuals. It's not really where I want it to be in the future. I really want to democratize this to the point where I can be in any country in the world and spend $10 and own a piece of infrastructure. That's kind of the dream here, and also run it all on renewable energy. But these are things that we work towards. But it's really, most of my job fundamentally is actually dumbing down a lot of these terms and bringing this basically so that you have something that looks more like a financial document than anything else. that you'd normally see, because we see a lot of enterprise level, investments and solutions and financial, kind of behemoths coming into the space. And so we're geared towards high net worth individuals and large clients like that.
All right.
On a large scale.
Yeah. Well, maybe let's break it down into 3 different segments then. Let's say first segment would be your average Joe the plumber, guy in the street who wants to talk to you and say, look, I've got 20 grand. What do you recommend? And then you've got let's say a small size enterprise that is interested in getting in. They can throw maybe, let's say, $250,000 into this. And then you've got the large institutions where, they can go 10 million plus, 5 million plus, whatever.
Yeah.
So how would you approach those 3 different clients?
So it's a really good, and that falls under the continuum of kind of services, right? For something as small as, say, Joe the plumber, I would say most of it is basically advising on what particular machine would be best for them, and then bringing them. And we really don't do a whole lot in that realm, just because it's just not kind of in our ballpark yet. But that would be basically pointing them towards a hosting facility that we know, that we trust, and maybe helping them at $20,000 get a slight discount on their machines. And so that's kind of where we put them. When you get to the $250,000 to $500,000, you're looking at potentially co-location. So instead of just basically paying somewhere in the 6 to 8 cent range for to host your miners, all in, maybe now you're co-locating with another smaller miner and owning some of the transformers or infrastructure around it. And then when you get to the higher level, it's quite literally either developing, say, like a brownfield, or like developing an actual site for it, or purchasing an existing site, or going and saying, all right, we're going to put mining pods, which are shipping containers converted to run miners, out on an actual gas pipeline or under solar panels, hopefully hydropower facility. So on the very high end, that's really that's primary, but that's but there is something for everyone here. I would say our minimum, though, generally is in order to actually move and start securing a lot of these lower power rates and good bulk discounts on miners, it's going to be in the 500,000 range and up.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I had a question about what you alluded to earlier, kind of maybe touch on it again. Project Verde. My Spanish isn't good. I think it means Project Green. And a lot of people talk about how Bitcoin's destroying the environment, but I think a lot of people make the case that running miners with renewable energy is actually a good thing. So I kind of want your take on that in general, and also kind of tell me a little bit more about Project Verde.
Yeah, absolutely. Project Verde is kind of my favorite thing to do during the day. I mean, we do it all, but in terms of kind of where we for the world, I mentally think that blockchain and Bitcoin is awesome I also think that it's really amazing for democratizing value and ownership. In sort of ever in history, I don't tie the products of my labor or my productive value to an institution or a government, which is, I think, really awesome, and really why I love Bitcoin. And then finally, I think you can actually save the planet by using Bitcoin. And the basic idea is that there's a ton of wasted energy on the planet, to the tune of millions and millions and millions of megawatts, and essentially by monetizing that, you can give that money back to renewable energy providers. So we look at Bitcoin, and I think I alluded to this a little bit, at least for Project Verde's purposes, and kind of my thesis on Bitcoin in general, as an economic battery of sorts. And what that really means is that this is a way to store value, and basically store the value of computational cycles. So rather than building out kind of very expensive either lithium ion, or there's obviously other battery storage techniques perfected by groups like Tesla or something, what you're actually doing is using composable demand. So bringing mining to a place where there's excess energy, and using the predictable monetization off that. And that's really why we are so big on data, is the predictable monetization of that to then transform essentially the livelihood of that renewable energy provider. So let's say the grid won't buy 5 megawatts. Well, you can either put the storage in and then sell it back to the grid, or you can run miners whenever there's, whenever there's not, whenever the grid curtails you, basically shuts you off because there's excess power, or there's higher demand versus supply versus demand. And that's really like, that's something that's really fascinating. So Project Verde is built on that idea of basically delivering mining pods anywhere on the planet, that can basically utilize them to predictably monetize excess power. I love like Greta Thunberg and like all of the stuff that's going on in terms of the climate strikes and all that. But I'm of the opinion fundamentally that if there's no money behind it, it doesn't function. Like Shell and all BP and all the major polluters in the world are all ready to switch to renewable energy because you can trend towards zero. You're not piping it in. You're not doing, there's less basically overall cost. But there needs to be a financial incentive. And so to give you an idea, like they spend billions of dollars basically in lobbying to keep fossil fuels around. The renewable energy providers spend almost nothing. I think in 2005 it was like $500,000 versus like multi millions to keep their like way of life around. And what better way to basically take on some of these enormous some of these enormous like powers that be than piggybacking on a $300+ billion public network to basically monetize. And so that's really where Project Verde is happening. We're trialing it out right now. We're basically finalizing talks with a bunch of Brazilian hydropower plants that actually have these transmission and curtailment issues, and should be deploying within the next 6 to 8 months there. So that's a really exciting and large project.
That's awesome. Harpia Mining is going international. I think, I wanted to play devil's advocate, but I think you made a pretty good rebuttal there. Because, people say, like, look at how many megawatts are used to mine Bitcoin. Well, look at how many megawatts are wasted every day.
Yeah. I also want to just, like, point out that it's only because we can see this because it's a public network, and we can kind of understand, essentially, like, okay, well, this many petahashes would be essentially this amount of electricity if you're looking at an average miner, that we understand the environmental impact of Bitcoin. People like to throw around these things like, oh, it takes more power than Iceland. Like if we then just take a step back and look at the hidden costs of the money we're printing it and transporting it in trucks, the armored trucks, like in even just the massive servers that these banks run, oftentimes not in highly optimized areas. You're looking at something that to run our fiat systems, especially all over the world, that don't interface perfectly with each other. You're looking at something that's so much greater than that. The entire Bitcoin network pales in comparison to something like Amazon and Google, right? While still transmitting value all over the planet for a fraction of any other system. So I look at it and I say, like, running a lot of power is not necessarily a problem. It's where you get that power and how you can monetize it for the provider. And in doing so, I think it's better just to use as much power as possible, especially if they're already producing it. Because at one point, they have to make a decision between spending more to buy more solar panels so they can create more energy and sell it, or spending, because it costs about the same amount to it, right? Spending that money on storage. And most of the time, they choose to build out more solar panels because there are more subsidies on that as well. And so what you look at is this problem of curtailment and wasted power going absolutely crazy and only getting worse. The figure I like to use is that, I've talked about this before, like in the spring, when this is at its worst, like 8,000 megawatts is curtailed in California on a daily basis. That's enough to power Boston. So it's not that we're not producing enough power, and it's not that renewables can't fundamentally, take over and make a greener grid. It's that our distribution is absolutely terrible, and it's antiquated. And by basically creating composable demand, you can solve that problem on the back of Bitcoin. And so that's where my passion truly lies.
Well, Josh, you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I was listening. I think it's pretty incredible, actually. Just to pose a thought experiment, if you could buy any piece of renewable energy land, so that may be a desert in Arizona somewhere, or a geothermal spot in Iceland, or maybe hydroelectric dam or something like that, where would you go for the best source of renewable energy for you to run your mining rigs?
I honestly think that look, anytime you look at these things, you gotta think, okay, is it intermittent power or is it constant energy, right? And so hydropower plants, for the most part, while there are flow differences in season, which are actually coincidentally reflected on the Bitcoin price, and I have a thesis about that, wet versus dry season in China and how it affects Bitcoin. But without getting too far into it, if I had to choose anything, I would probably choose geothermal, and I'd probably choose Iceland. Although right now the political climate may not be the best for it there, but it's because it's constant power and there's no flow changes for the most part. The next step would be, or the next one would totally be hydro, and then probably wind or solar is a close second. I like solar; I think it's cool. So, but offshore wind would be
okay.
Yeah,
that's cool.
You want something that's
I don't want to
right?
cut you short. Let's
No.
go into that. Let's go into that China dry and wet. You know, the dry season, the wet season in China. I think that's an interesting topic to discuss. Do you mind expanding on that a little bit?
Yeah, not at all. There are differences in terms of like essentially how much water is running through turbines in the major production, like the major Bitcoin mining centers in China. Unlike the United States, like for example Boston, where you have a housing problem, China is like going to China kind of like moves in the way like you're going to like Kohl's or Macy's or something and buying like all the shoes for your children before they grow up into them on deep discount. So they'll build like entire cities and then move population centers to them and give incentives for businesses to go there. But there's a lot of what we call ghost cities there, which are essentially like cities where it's already built out. And some of these experiments have worked really well. Like Shenzhen used to be a fishing village, and now it's the major manufacturing hub of the world. But other cities are basically out there, like in Inner Mongolia, right? And you've got so much power to power a city, and no one using it. So these have been one of the common misconceptions about China is that a lot of Bitcoin is actually mined on coal. Yes, that is true to some extent, but a lot more is actually mined on renewables and in actually hydro, with these ghost cities where the infrastructure and the transformation of the power is already there, and all you have to do is kind of build out your mining farm. The issue is that at some points the flow rate basically through these turbines is much lower. So I might not have the I guess the dates or months correct, but I think it's like March through December is wet season, and then everything else is essentially dry season. And so during the wet season, since there's more rain coming down, it's gonna you have way more, basically more turbines spinning, so to speak, and you've got lower power costs, which means you can turn on more miners that would be as we talked about price fluctuations, or I mean electricity costs. You can turn on more miners that wouldn't be on before. And this is also where you can turn on older stuff as well. And so you see, I think, pretty noticeable hash rate jumps, at least in the past, from wet season to dry season. And I think it also impacts difficulty. And so, but also you got to think about these people needing to pay their operational costs, meaning that most miners will mine for profit, but they'll use some of the Bitcoin, sell it off, and then use that to basically pay their operational costs. And so a lot of them are trading on OTC, or over-the-counter desks, right? So they don't affect Bitcoin price as much, but you see basically more Bitcoin available for sale versus people hodling it because they're running just more machines and have to pay for more OPEX. And so I haven't proven this out. I'm pretty busy on a day-to-day basis, but I have this thesis that essentially that during the wet season, by selling more Bitcoin and increasing volume, that the price should go up. And so if I had more time, or if I could clone myself, I would totally just spend like 3 months doing that study and then publishing it or something like that. But that's kind of where my head's at about that.
That's interesting. That's really interesting. And you mentioned OTC, so over the counter, just for people that are listening and might not know what that is, That's where you're not going on an exchange. You're not using an exchange to trade between people. You're basically going direct to the person that you're buying from or selling to. And do you actually have connections with OTC desks? And can you expand on that a little bit more? That's an interesting topic to get into.
Sure. I mean, it's not something we've utilized thus far, but we do have connections to OTC desks and banks that can trade. Kind of like, you'll sell a bank account, so to speak, with a bunch of Bitcoin inside, which is another way to transfer. But OTC desks are interesting also because there is with kind of incoming regulation, there's this idea of like virgin coins or I don't know if that's the proper term for it, but essentially coins that have just been mined, achieving a higher valuation than kind of I guess coins that have been passed around, and because it's kind of like because the government basically says, and this is the U.S. government basically says, yeah, we'll be tracking the transactions, and so if you don't want to have that happen, it's kind of like a ghost gun, right? You can go buy a gun in a store, but if you commit a murder with it, then they can trace it back to you. Well, if you go buy a gun with no serial number or whatever it's called, identification on it, then you can commit a murder and it won't be traced back to you. Similar thing, that by trying to add more regulation and kind of scrutiny to the Bitcoin network, you're actually kind of backfiring on you because these virgin coins will be worth more. And so in terms of if that does happen, we'll be dealing with a lot more OTC desks because there'll be higher demand for mined coins to the tune of, some people have said, like 30% higher markup on those coins, which is nuts. But not something we do on a normal basis, though we do have the connections. Crypto is really small, especially the mining community. There's like probably 120, 150 people that are like really doing it. And then, there's a bunch of people that cycle out every couple of years, especially when there's bear markets and stuff and people shut down their mines. And there's a lot of companies now that are starting kind of like what we do, is providing services to miners and not straight up mining themselves. Although, our end goal is to be really mining for ourselves as well. So,
well, you mentioned about, incoming regulations and legislation and more oversight from the government, things of that nature. So what are your thoughts on the privacy coins that are out there? So you've got your PivX, you've got your Dash, you've got your Zcash, you've got your Zcoin, and you got your Monero. What are your thoughts on those types of coins?
I'm interested in the privacy aspect to a great deal. I think that I think, as I kind of said before, it's really important for people to have a way to store their value without tying their labor to basically their government. And this is kind of the first time in history where you can do that. To some extent, you can do that with gold, but it's very hard to transfer a bunch of gold, and you can't really like walk across a border with it. And so I look at this and I'm like, fundamentally, I think we have to pay respects to kind of the cypherpunks and the people that really designed all this, and kind of implemented it and had this idea of the ability to transfer privately and not be watched on everything you do, and own value and be able to transfer that peer to peer. And so I'm really in favor of privacy coins. My favorite story is the kind of the founder, or I guess the guy who created Monero. They asked him like, well, where's all your Monero? He's like, yeah, I had the private key written on a piece of paper, and I was on a cruise and it just like slipped out of my hand, and so I don't own any more Monero anymore. And it's just kind of like pointing fun at them, like, try me. You know what I mean? Like you can't figure it out. Even if I did have a $1 billion of Monero, like you won't be able to find it anyway. So like kind of like get out of here. I might be a little bit of a kind of a crypto anarchist or something when I say that, like, I absolutely love privacy coins, and I understand there's a dark underbelly to it, and and with anything, there's a lot of corruption in mining, there's a lot of scammers in crypto, but I like, especially like Monero, Zcoin, like all those things, I'm a huge fan of it. I say resist and resist and resist until they kind of give in, because they can't control it, the powers that be. So
yeah, I'm a big fan of privacy coins too. I was at one of my local crypto meetups and someone gave me some Beam, and that's a pretty interesting project as well. But yeah, I'm a big fan of crypto, private cryptocurrency for sure. Immutable, unfungible,
One thing that's really
untraceable.
impressive is Zcoin have managed to actually get on prompt pay. So prompt pay is a payment network with the banks in Thailand. I'm very surprised at that, because now you can essentially live in Thailand completely anonymously, paying only with Zcoin, and prompt pays in 5 million different locations throughout Thailand.
Are you serious? That's incredible.
I'm serious. It's absolutely incredible. So I couldn't believe it at first when I heard about it from the Zcoin guys. And then I looked into it, and there's a short documentary where a guy went out for about 3 weeks and just lived exclusively on Zcoin. And you can buy it you can spend it at local markets, because what prompt pay is essentially like a QR code that's hooked up to the banking system in Thailand. And I don't know how they managed to pull it off. They probably met the right guy and did the right deal at the right Noribang or whatever. And now you can basically live off the grid in Thailand if you've got enough Zcoin. I thought it was incredible. So
that's awesome.
Yeah. Just to wrap this up, because we've covered so much today, I think it's been an awesome interview. Honestly, you've got a depth of knowledge which is clear. So it's been a fantastic podcast episode. We're going to clip this up into lots of different clips, because we've covered a lot. But there's something we do at the end, which is just for fun.
I got one more question before that, though. Real quick, though, if you could, Jesse, what is the biggest obstacle to mass adoption in your view to adopting crypto? Why is it still such a niche and no one knows about it, no one uses it, no one buys it, no one hodls it?
I think it's first off, I think that the number one thing that I've always had to deal with is people are like, I can't afford a Bitcoin. And I'm like, that's great, but you can afford a couple of cents of Bitcoin. So when people say that to me, I always transfer them Bitcoin. And I think that ownership, like if there was some way, there used to be Bitcoin faucets, and they were a lot more popular than they are now. But back when Bitcoin was worth less, you had people tipping each other in it. You had people that were kind of giving it out on forums that were doing things with it. And I think in many ways, while I am deeply involved in the idea of hodling, and I believe it will go, exponential. And in many ways, I'm hoping, I'm betting a lot of my productive life on it. I think just using Bitcoin is a lot more meaningful, and I think that's the main pain point in adoption. So whenever someone says basically well, I can't afford Bitcoin, well, I can't do this, I tell them download Jax or another wallet on your phone, and I will send you it in real time, and it makes it real for them. My co-founder Pedro, the CEO of the company, he actually he this is a very interesting thing, because he lives halfway in Brazil, halfway in the United States, and so he keeps most of his wealth similar to some of the big guys in crypto in Bitcoin. I would say probably 95% of his wealth is in Bitcoin, and the reason is because he can transfer out to reais in Brazil, and he can transfer to US dollars here. And using BitPay and stuff like that, you can we'll literally be at a crypto conference, and he will purchase the Uber by using Bitcoin. There's one step in between, but eventually there won't be that step. But just using it goes against the whole idea of hodling and this is a store of value. But just using crypto, I think, makes it so much more real to people that you can purchase things, that you can transfer information, when it comes to the Ethereum network. And really that idea that I can't afford it, it's it's too foreign. And this is very similarly to Venmo. So if I had any one thing that I would love to do, I would love to do something like QR codes, mom and pop, literally place a sticker on that, and you can just pay using crypto, or Venmo with Bitcoin, right? That's that, bringing it to more people. I think that's the hardest thing, to just get over that initial hump, oh, it's foreign and I can't own it. People start using, understand it.
Yeah, definitely. It's oh, I can't afford 100-pound bar of gold. Well, you can probably afford a gold coin. It's
exactly.
Bitcoin's divisible for sure. All right, Josh, you want to hit him with our last question?
Well, I was just going to expand on that now we've gone there. So I often send bits of Bitcoin to my cousins and stuff when it's their birthday, because they don't know anything about it. I'm just generate an address and I'll send you some Bitcoin. So we've got some cousins up in Scotland, and whenever they hit a birthday, I send them a little bit of Bitcoin. A couple of years ago, I sent them 0.1 Bitcoin when it was
Wow.
maybe $500. So that was good. He definitely remembers that, and I think it's always good to share the wealth and the knowledge, because once people have got it, they get it. That something clicks in their head, and they really understand it. There's something about actually
much appreciated.
Yeah, receiving it and being able to understand it and use it. Then it's that's the paradigm shift that people have. So just to wrap it up, normally we do something fun, and it's just the price prediction for Bitcoin in the next year by 2020. We've talked about the halving coming in. So personally, I'm quite bullish about price in the next year. I think that I called a high of 86 and a low of 6 in 2020. What are your thoughts on the price?
So I guess I'll start with I am a huge Tim Draper fan. I went through Draper University, so I know him personally. Awesome visionary guy. He's totally wacky. It's awesome to be around him. And he predicted if 5% of the world's wealth goes into Bitcoin, that's $250,000 a coin. And so I look at that and I'm like, that is very, very possible, especially with like the rise of authoritarian governments and kind of like for example, like Venezuela is like pretty much run on Bitcoin now. But so that's like the high end in the next couple of years. In terms of 2020, I'm a little bit more bearish than you. I'm thinking like high of 47 and probably low of 5,500. I don't think it's going to go much below that. I think that's the shut off point once the halving comes for a lot of miners. So I don't see it going anywhere there. But I remember the run up in 2017 and 2018 when like everyone and their grandma was buying Bitcoin, and when it shot up to 20,000. And I remember basically like the run from around 11 or 12,000 all the way to 20. Where I started, I had made a serious amount of profit. I started selling off at 10 because I was like, there's no freaking way it's going to go higher than this. Then it was like 12 the next day. And then like that day it went to 15. And I look at a run like that and I'm like, there are specific price points that once we break, for example, like 9,600, I'm no trader, but like, these are mental points. Like 10,000 is a huge mental point. 12,000 is a huge mental point. I see a run if we get anywhere in the 20 range, all the way up to 40 something. So I think what I said was 47, and 55 is low.
Sweet, that's nice. It's good to hear that you share some bullish sentiment. Maybe not as bullish as myself, but we predicted a very similar low, which is interesting because yours is actually based on the cost to produce Bitcoin. So that's really interesting. Yeah. I've got to say thanks. Yeah. It's been a great episode, really. We've covered so much, so I'm going to look forward to reviewing this and going back and cutting this up into segments. Honestly, it's going to be great.
Nice. And Jesse, we'll give you the last word. Do you have anything else you want to say today to close it out?
First off, awesome job here too, you guys. Crypto is built on people's participation. Like that's really the vision of this, is that you're not just working for some bigger entity. You're participating. That's what miners are. They're participants on a network. And so by doing stuff like this and bringing this out to a larger audience, you're basically like, we're all Satoshi in that way. You're doing your part to basically bring this out and educate people, which is, I think, fundamentally the most important thing we can do in cryptocurrency right now. A huge percentage of my day-to-day with my teammates, guess like team members, I'll shout out Pedro, our CEO, Zach, our junior analyst, Alex, our resident like Yoda guru, data center expert. Like what we do fundamentally is a lot of education and then putting all the pieces together. But by doing podcasts like this and starting here, you guys are like really doing your part. So thank you for having me. Awesome to be here. And I hope that more people start looking at crypto as a way to, like, I think this is like the last thing I want to say, is that looking at it as a way to separate from kind of the way our governments, especially in the United States, is kind of treating. Like, I'm not trying to get too political, but if we have any inkling that maybe their intentions are not in our best, or I guess I should say that's like, if we have any inkling that maybe our best intentions are not being met, it's so important to have this alternative. It's why it was created in 2000, after 2008, to have this alternative to store value. And it's really important to educate about that and make sure that people understand that there's another option. And so we're all doing our part here. But I really hope that this podcast completely blows up, and you guys are hitting a huge audience here, and I'm very happy to be a part of it. So thank you so much.
All right, awesome. Well, that'll wrap it up for this episode, and until next time, this is it, and you can find Blockade, hodling, and FPGA mining on the dark side of the Hodl moon.
Hodl.
Awesome, guys.
Hodl moon!